Pigs helped build civilization, then vanished. In places that fattened our first feasts, they became symbols of impurity. How does a barnyard friend turn into a boundary line? Bones draw a map. Early abundance in wet, wooded valleys, sudden drop-offs in drier highlands. At Philistine coastal towns, pork piles up. A day's walk inland, almost none. Temples burn offerings, towns dump scraps. And yet whole communities draw a hard no around pork. Ecology whispers one thing, identity shouts another. We'll track pigs through middens, temples, and texts to see how water needs, disease risks, and social rivalry hardened into law, splitting neighbors, shaping faith, redrawing maps. This is Armchair Archaeology, where artifacts meet story and landscapes explain laws. Stay to the end for a lab-tested twist, an ancient migration traced not by pottery, but by pig DNA.
Start where the soil stays damp and the air smells of chaff. River villages in Anatolia and the northern Levant. Paddies and wetlands along the Yangtze's old courses. Grain comes in, peels go out, and a sharp nose arrives on schedule. Pigs don't need herders, only leftovers and a cool patch of shade. They move themselves to the food. Domestication here isn't a single spark, it's brush fire. Communities on both ends of Asia invite local boar into their orbit, and the bones begin to change. Teeth wear differently when an animal eats porridge scrap instead of mast. Jaws tighten when people cull young. In some layers, the enamel reads like a calendar with the seasons rubbed off. Less hunger, more penning. You can almost see the fence in the chemistry. Feasts make the case better than any chart. In ceremonial pits, shoulders and jaws gather in neat, intentional clusters, ash-dusted and knife-clean. This isn't random refuse. It's the social work of meat. A pig on the ground is a favor paid, a status claimed, a festival sealed. Households that can turn grain into pork signal surplus. Households that share it signal power. Yet fences are suggestions in a world full of forests. Wild boar patrol the edges of fields, and village sows meet them through the slats. The genome remembers every visit. Ancient DNA pulls a faint thread through the bones. Domestic lines tugged back toward the wild, again and again. Domesticated pig in the early millennia is less a fixed breed than an agreement renewed each season, half pen, half thicket. Follow water and you find pigs flourishing. Delta hamlets, lakeside orchards, shady lanes between mud brick courtyards. Climb into thinner, drier air, and the arithmetic shifts. Goats walk farther for less, give milk as well as meat, and don't foul a cistern the way a rooting pig can. From the start, the map of where pigs thrive is a map of where people can spare water, scraps, and patience, and where they can't. If patterns like these change how you read the past, you'll feel at home here. Subscribe so the next dig finds you first.
In some towns, the gods ate pork. Temple kitchens in Mesopotamia list offerings by cut, and the refuse backs them up. Greasy mandibles, shoulder blades with tidy knife strokes, ash that tells of slow, controlled fires. This isn't random dinner, it's a menu for the divine. When pig appears in those pit layers beside beer jars and barley loaves, you can feel the logic. Fat as honor, abundance as piety. The deity fed like a king because the city wants rain, victory, or just a steady year. Cross to the Nile in the meaning tilts. Scenes and later texts edge the pig toward Set, the spoiler god. Priestly purity cycles turn swineherds into walking exceptions. Temple dumps near sacred precincts are conspicuously light on pig bones. even when nearby towns toss a few into their ordinary trash. The rule is not absolute. Egypt is big, time is long, but the pattern persists. Where ritual purity is the point, pork is the line you don't cross. Swing around the Aegean, and this script flips again. Festival deposits put piglets right at center stage. Bones cluster in sacred fills with libation cups. The cut marks are crisp, the burning deliberate. One agrarian rite stages fertility through the body of the animal. Piglets are buried in pits, left to transform, then their remains are brought back up and mingled with seed. It reads macabre at first glance, but in context, it's agriculture turned into theater. Decay as blessing, fat as the promise of next year's harvest. Move between these worlds and the lesson is blunt. The pig is not inherently sacred or dirty. It's a mirror held up to local anxieties and hopes. In Mesopotamia, pork can be a gift that binds city to God. In Egypt's stricter precincts, it's the pollutant that keeps the god's table clean. In the Aegean, a piglet's short life becomes a parable about soil. And the ground remembers the choice, bone by bone, layer by layer. Like the vessels that outlast the meal, the ancient secrets mug is made for long reads and field notes. Quiet, sturdy, and a touch ritual. Find it in the description and pin comment.
A pig is a walking water budget. Soft skin, no sweat-saving wool, a love for shade and mud. Everything about the animal assumes a damp world. In river valleys, that's easy. Kitchen scraps become feed, puddles become wallows, and the animal repays the favor by turning refuse into meat fast. Shift the scene a few ridgelines inland, and the arithmetic flips. Shade thins out, water gathers in guarded cisterns, and every splash has to justify itself. A flock of goats will march for miles and sip like misers. A pig will stand in the doorway, grunting for a bucket. Desert edges magnify the problem. Pigs root, and rooting near wells is a public health hazard. They'll nose into anything your household discards, including the stuff you'd rather keep away from your water. Parasites ride along if meat is hurried or undercooked. Communities learn by consequences. One sick season teaches more than a dozen sermons. Archaeology catches the shift in quiet ways. In lowland sites, pig bones are heavy and young, animals slaughtered quick for tender meat. Their teeth wear down on soft human food. In nearby uplands, the ratio collapses, replaced by sheep and goats that browse scrub, make milk, and leave the water clean. Chemical traces in some pig teeth record a childhood without harsh dry seasons, as if the animal lived under a roof with regular feedings. Just over the hills, those signatures vanish, along with the species. What looks like taboo later begins as triage. When keeping pigs means hauling extra water, fencing orchards, and risking a fouled well, restraint becomes common sense, and common sense hardens into custom. Neighbors who can afford rivers keep pork on the table and host big, greasy festivals. Those who can't start to talk about purity. Not because they lack taste, but because purity is the language that keeps the cistern clear and the herd sensible. Over time, the landscape does the teaching. People translate the lesson into rules, and then raise their children to hear the rule first, long after the lesson's weather has changed. Walk the ridgeline into the Iron Age highlands, and the menu changes. Hearth ash looks the same, pots blacken the same, neighbors argue over the same wells, yet the bone buckets tell on the cooks. Pig is nearly absent. A day's walk downslope on the Philistine coast, refuse heaps glitter with mandibles and shoulder blades. Two communities share climate and trade routes, but their trash draws a border sharper than any wall. Excavators started noticing the pairing. The 4-room house plan, collared mem storage jars, family courtyards, and almost no pig. The combination isn't an accident of preservation, it repeats across hill country towns. In lowland cities with Aegean-style pottery and different urban habits, pork is ordinary. The contrast is so consistent that field labs joke about it. Tip a bag of bones onto the tray and you can often guess the site's identity before you see a single inscription. What makes the absence speak is how total it grows over time. Early highland layers sometimes show a straggler rib or two. Later levels tighten the rule. The change comes alongside a broader project of drawing lines, Sabbath rhythms, harvest tithes, purity around temples and graves. Avoiding pork isn't the whole story of identity, but it's the part you taste 3 times a day. When your neighbor's festival smells like roasted piglet and yours does not, difference stops being theoretical. The soils back it up in quieter ways. At mixed border sites, children's burials and household dumps can sit only a street apart, yet the faunal ratios diverge cleanly with architecture and cooking kit. At Tel Dan and other northern tells, shifts through the strata map political eras. More pig and periods of coastal influence, less as hill country norms assert themselves. The theology on parchment starts as a habit at the hearth, a community choosing goats and lambs over pigs until the choice becomes a marker, then a badge. Law will come later to explain and defend it, but long before the rule is read aloud, the ground has already memorized it, layer after layer, dinner after dinner. Where do you think the border truly began here? At the well? At the hearth? Or in the text? If you stood between coast and highland, which table would you choose, and why?
By the time the purity rules are written down, the table manners are already old. The world that produces Leviticus and Deuteronomy is a patchwork. Memories of the late bronze collapse, new hill towns growing stubbornly on thin soils, coastal powers rising and falling, and empires, Assyrian, then Babylonian, then Persian, pressing in with census lists and carved laws of their own. Communities that eat together survive together, and the safest traditions are the ones you can carry. The food rule lands with a tidy phrase, split hoof but no cud. And suddenly, the barnyard sorts itself into hours and off the table. That line fits the landscape's lessons. Caprines for the hills, cattle when water allows, pigs where it doesn't, except now the logic isn't only ecological, it's covenantal. The meal is no longer just fuel, it's a rehearsal of belonging. Text scholars trace seams in the fabric. Sections that speak with the voice of priests sit beside laws concerned with fields and gates. Some commandments look older, others sound like they've learned to travel. The exiles, sent east with their stories and their habits, need a faith that doesn't depend on a particular altar or a particular river valley. Editors stitch pragmatism into poetry. A rule born near cisterns becomes portable. A pocket-sized ritual any household can keep at sunset, far from home. You can watch the law tighten in parallel with history. As the hill country habit of skipping pork hardens into identity, the written word gives it scaffolding. Priestly calendars surround it with fasts and offerings. Narrative frames anchor it in memory. Wildness at the edge of camp, holiness at the center. When communities return and rebuild under Persian eyes, the rule returns with them, carrying the authority of exile, what we kept when everything else fell away. The effect is quiet but durable. 1,000 meals later, a child asks why there's lamb and goat, but never pig, and the answer reaches back past parchment to firesides and fields. The text didn't invent the boundary, it made it last.
Follow the road east, and the menu starts repeating. Caravans leave Fustad, cross Sinai, and pour into Damascus, Baghdad, Nishapur. Languages change. Coinage changes. Spices spin with the season, yet the butcher's stall looks familiar. Lamb, goat, beef. The absence becomes the constant. What began as a hill country habit, then a written rule, turns into a regional marketplace logic. Centuries after Israelite law hardens, the Quran gives the ban its own cadence. Jurists argue the edges, necessity, contamination, what to do with a borrowed pot, but kitchens don't wait for footnotes. Inns, guilds, and city inspectors codify what already works. A standard meat supply everyone can eat. A traveler who keeps kosher and a traveler who follows halal can sit at the same table without asking what simmered in the pan last week. Ideas ride on people. Merchants marry far from home and bring their kitchen rules. Scholars copy law for new courts. Soldiers settle with familiar appetites. Over time, the prohibition becomes infrastructure. Licenses list permitted cuts. Fines punish clandestine stalls, and cookware is sold in materials that wash clean of impurity. In the paper trail, you can watch the system breathe. Letters ordering salted mutton for the road. Contracts specifying no swine in market leases. Judges deciding what cleanses a tainted ladle. Step back, and a belt of porkless cuisine emerges from North Africa through the Levant into Central Asia like an isobar on a weather map. And in the odd notes that survive, you catch the scale. A medieval traveler can land in a city he's never seen and without a word find meat he's allowed to eat. The rule that once marked difference now stitches together strangers. That's the quiet trick of daily law. Because it touches breakfast and not just festivals, it persists. Markets stabilize, cooks plan, families migrate without losing their table. By the time a child asks why pork isn't sold, the answer is everywhere. On the butcher's hook, in the pot, and in the ease with which a caravan can eat its way across a continent.
Walk into a Roman market and you can hear the difference. Squeals from wicker crates, sausages looped like garlands, a butcher bragging about acorns that sweetened his hogs. In the classical world, pork isn't suspicious, it's the headliner. Farm manuals teach how to fatten pigs on orchard waste. Festivals crown a roast as the centerpiece. Satire jokes that Rome loves pigs so much it worships them twice, alive and on the platter. Trash heaps agree. Urban dumps from Italy to the provinces are thick with pig bones, many from young animals killed at peak tenderness, the cuts trimmed with a precision that looks like ritual even when it's just dinner. Into this kitchen walks a new movement, still speaking a Jewish dialect of faith. Its earliest followers keep the dietary fence, their Gentile neighbors do not. Congregations in mixed cities share hymns, but not always a table. Letters pulse with logistics, who eats with whom, what's been sacrificed where, whether a community is defined by menu or by Messiah. The debate crests in a small, consequential meeting. Leaders in Jerusalem freed Gentile believers from Israel's food laws, asking only for a short list aimed at unity. Suddenly, a faith that began behind a kosher wall can spread through tenements where the air smells like pork fat and fish sauce. The choice is practical and explosive. Meals become a bridge instead of a barricade, and Christian house churches learn to live inside Rome's diet without absorbing Rome's pantheon.
Archaeology catches the adaptation in mundane corners. The same neighborhoods that host early assemblies also produce faunal profiles indistinguishable from their pagan neighbors, heavy on pig, while inscriptions and burial habits mark a different allegiance entirely. Even Roman humor, which loved to needle porkless Judeans, helps frame the contrast. By late antiquity, the joke no longer fits the mixed table. What emerges is a pivot in where identity lives. For Israel, purity carved the boundary at the plate. For the early church, the plate becomes neutral ground, and creed carries the line. In a world that roasts pigs for victory and harvest, that shift opens doors and fills seats.
Menus survive in stubborn fragments. A rim sherd blackened where the fire licked too high. A knife mark angled just so across a rib. Grease sealed into the pores of a cooking jar and released centuries later in a lab as a faint chemical whisper of what once simmered there. Reconstructing meals means stacking these whispers until a voice emerges. Bones are the headline, but they don't sing alone. Number of identified specimens can skew toward big, durable pieces. Tiny pig phalanges slip through coarse screens, and trash moves around when courtyards are rebuilt. That's why archaeologists pair faunal counts with context. Which room, what layer, near a hearth or out by a drain? Add micro-remains, charred seeds, phytoliths, starch, and you can tell a stew from a roast, a feast from a Tuesday. Case studies make the method feel real. At Tel Dan, layer by layer, pig frequency rises and falls with political weather. Coastal influence creeps in, then retreats, and the bone ratios follow like a shadow. Lachish splits along class lines. Elite compounds lean beef and caprine, while more modest quarters show a pragmatic mix that shifts with siege and peace. Megiddo gets personal. A cluster of domestic jars from ordinary houses yields lipids pointing to ruminant fats again and again. Then one jar refuses to fit. Its residue fingerprint aligns with pig fat, quiet as a secret recipe kept in one kitchen when the neighborhood norm ran the other way. A rule can be public, a pot can be private. Even butcher marks turn into choreography. Joints separated the same way across multiple pits imply shared training, perhaps a market guild or a household tradition passed down at a block's edge. Burn intensity maps onto festival cycles and hurried wartime meals. None of these clues alone proves a taboo. Together, they show habit, pressure, and choice. The result isn't a single ancient diet, but a patchwork of tables, some loud, some discreet. All legible if you listen for the scrape of a knife, the smoke on a rim, and the fat that refused to leave the clay.
A meal is an invitation and a border at the same time. Who sits, what's served, and which pots were used say as much about belonging as any oath. In crowded empires, Assyrian officials counting heads, Babylonian scribes filing taxes, Persian governors balancing loyalties, small communities learn that survival often starts at the table. Keep your rules clear, and you can recognize your people at a glance. Keep them portable, and you can carry home on the road. Anthropologists would later give this intuition a language. Mary Douglas argued that dirt is matter out of place, that purity rules map the edges of a world. A pig isn't dirty in itself, it's the animal that crosses the categories your story needs to stay intact. Marvin Harris pushed from the other side, resources and costs. In Dry Hills,
pigs drink too much and give back too little. Call that inefficiency impurity, and the lesson sticks. Neither lens fits everything, but together they explain why a rule about meat can feel like a rule about meaning. Empires apply pressure, and the rules thicken. If your neighbor's feast smells like pork, and yours never will, you can spot your own festival from across the street. Alms and charity organize along the same lines. Shared kitchens, trusted butchers, a widow's pot filled by hands that know which ladle can touch which stew. In siege narratives and famine lists, the pattern shows up in the rations themselves. Communities that avoid pork don't bend when grain runs thin. They reallocate protein, tighten fasts, and preserve a hierarchy of foods that keeps identity intact when walls crack. There's a human cost to every boundary. Purity rules protect, but they can exclude. The same clarity that knits a scattered people together can mark others as forever guest. Welcome, but not quite family. And yet, for groups living under larger powers, that clarity often means they're still there in the next generation to argue about it. Politics happens in assemblies and courts, but it also happens over stew. Who stirs, who eats, and which recipes make strangers into neighbors, or keep them politely across the room.
The old border didn't fade. It changed costume. Look at a modern city map through the layer of food. Kosher and halal butchers cluster like constellations. Their delivery vans tracing lines that feel ancient even when the storefronts are new. Festivals still smell different from block to block. In some neighborhoods, winter holidays mean braises rich with lamb. In others, a roast that would be unthinkable across the street. You can walk these divides with your eyes closed and still know when you've crossed them. Genetics adds a second map. Modern pig breeds carry mitochondrial signatures that run along familiar corridors. Aegean to Anatolia to the Levant. Anatolia to Cyprus. Arabian Gulf links pulling east. Ancient DNA fills in the gaps, matching old bones to living lineages and revealing where people moved animals and themselves. The surprising part isn't that pigs travel with us. It's how faithfully their genomes remember our roads centuries after the caravans stop. There are practical echoes too. Global supply chains quietly respect religious rules. Slaughterhouses label lines, school cafeterias sort menus, airlines pre-plan trays so strangers can share a row without sharing a problem. Meanwhile, feral populations in the Americas and Oceania remind us how quickly pigs revert when culture stops policing them. Release domestic stock into a new landscape and the bodies change. Snouts lengthen, coats darken, behaviors flip from pen to thicket in a few generations. Biology moves fast. Taboos move faster when people care enough to teach them. And identity still cooks at home. Families navigate mixed workplaces and shared apartment blocks with kitchen hacks and inherited scripts, separate pans, trusted shops, labels read twice. The rule is no longer a response to one region's drought. It's a portable story about who we are, repeated at lunch. That's the through line from the first river hamlets to the screen you're watching now. Landscapes set the terms, communities turn them into customs, and customs become the bones future archaeologists will read. Which brings us back to the evidence that changed how we draw the ancient map, a piece of the puzzle we've been saving for the end.
Across the Near East, landscapes trained people to keep or quit the pig. In wet valleys, pork was efficiency and celebration. In thirsty hills, it was trouble at the well. Households turned a water budget into a habit, habit into boundary, and boundary into law. Once written, those rules outlived the droughts that taught them, carrying identity through exile, empire, and the long ordinary of dinner. Now the promised twist.
when the so-called Sea Peoples settled as Philistines along the Levantine coast. Archaeologists found pig bones whose DNA doesn't match local boar. The earliest Iron Age layers at coastal sites carry Aegean-style genetic signatures, as if small herds, piglets in baskets, breeding stock, and shipholds sailed with their owners. A century or two later, those foreign lineages blur as local boar mix in and the genome goes native. Pottery can imitate. Architecture can be borrowed. Pig DNA, quiet, stubborn, maps a migration you can taste. It draws a line from island kitchens to coastal feasts more clearly than any painted pot. That's the bigger armchair theme. Laws remember landscapes, and bodies remember journeys. What began as ecological wisdom hardened into spiritual boundary, and then became a bridge between prehistory and faith, letting communities carry home wherever they camped. If this changed how you read an ancient rule, tell me in the comments. Which modern food line have you crossed or kept, and why? If you want more digs like this, hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss the next excavation of everyday life. Share this with someone who thinks bones are boring. We'll prove them wrong, one midden at a time. Until next time, keep questioning, stay curious, and remember, every law remembers a landscape, and every landscape, once dry enough, can turn survival into scripture.